Good evening, everyone. Hello. Welcome. My name is Jonathan. I'm the lead organizer here at YIMBY Melbourne. Thank you all for coming. This is such a phenomenal turnout for a Wednesday evening spent speaking about planning reform, but we promise it's not going to be dry. It's going to be good. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the lands we're on today, the lands we're gathered on, are that of the peoples of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respect to the elders past and present and acknowledge that when we talk about the housing crisis in all its forms, it's a crisis that disproportionately affects First Nations people across this country, and it's a cause worth fighting for. Thank you all again. Welcome, each and every one of you, to Unbanning Beauty, presented by us here at YIMBY Melbourne. Thanks. If you don't know us, which someone does, we're a grassroots volunteer-run organization advocating for housing abundance. Currently, we live under a regime of housing scarcity, one where rental inspection queues go around the block, where those same rents soar unabated, and where poorer people are being pushed further and further from the highest amenity areas of our inner city. The antidote to all these problems: build more homes where people want to live. But everyone in this room knows that we need more housing. Tonight, we go a bit further. Like all Melburnians, we here at YIMBY Melbourne know that this great and beautiful city deserves great and beautiful homes, comprising great and beautiful streets, comprising great and beautiful neighborhoods. You get the idea. Density is not a dirty word. In fact, it should be a beautiful word. It does, after all, typify the most iconic cities in the world, be it Paris, London, Tokyo, New York. Melbourne deserves to be a city on the same scale and stage as those juggernauts, and we hope that tonight will be a meaningful step towards that. Tonight, 3 experts are going to guide us through the problems and solutions associated with building more beauty across Melbourne. These people are smarter than me, and I'm so privileged, and we are so privileged to have them here. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand some of the design-driven problems and solutions that we need in order to confront and implement respectively in order to ensure that Melbourne builds more and builds more beautifully. First up, Austin Maynard Architects principal architect Andrew Maynard is going to lay out some of the problems the current system forces designers to contend with and how it makes it so challenging to create beautiful outcomes. Then, planner and Ratio CEO Colleen Peterson is going to guide us through a model for reform, pointing us toward the codification of neighbourhood character, creating standards for entire streets rather than micromanaging individual builds. Finally, KTA Director and Principal Kerstin Thompson will take us through a project that exemplifies beauty, that worked through complex legislation and got a great outcome. She'll point us toward the standard of build and beauty that reforms must make it easier to pull off across our incredible city. So, now, without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. Andrew Maynard began Austin Maynard Architects, then Andrew Maynard Architects in 2002. Born, raised, and educated in Tasmania, Andrew moved to Melbourne after graduating from the University of Tasmania. Winner of a plethora of awards, he says in the bio that he wrote for himself, including the Canberra Medallion, the Eleanor Cullis Hill National Architecture Award, the John and Phyllis Murphy Award, and many more. Andrew's primary focus has been single residential homes. However, in recent years, Andrew and Austin Maynard Architects have delved into multi-residential housing as both developer and architect, resulting in Terrace House, an 8.2-star sustainable community that won ArcDaily's Building of the Year Award, gold at the Good Design Awards, and a swath of sustainability and architecture awards. Then there was the 9.1-star Park Life at Nightingale Village and Slate House, an 8.2-star development in Brighton. Andrew was a founding director of Nightingale Housing, and in 2022, Austin Maynard Architects were winners of Designe's prestigious Architecture Studio of the Year Award. Give it up for Andrew Maynard.
Hi, everybody. Lovely to see your beautiful faces. How good is this space? I haven't been here for ages. And thank you, Sophie, for writing that bio. Jonathan, I didn't write it. All right. That's the weapon of choice. Here we go. This is great. This is a great forum. And I love being the warm-up act. You've probably seen some of our stuff. We have developed put on the hat of the developer and the architect on a couple of projects where we got mates, we got past clients and friends to invest their hard-earned money to help us build some super sustainable fossil fuel-free buildings, including Park Life, which is sort of become a bit of the pin-up child of the Nightingale Village, which has just taken out every award ever. What's compelling about these buildings is these are a product of war through the planning process every single time. And we end up at VCAT, not Park Life, but we end up at VCAT so often, we win, we waste a lot of money, council wastes a lot of money to end up where we started. Really focused on community, really focused on super sustainability, 9.1 stars. And then also looking at projects like this, which is in this missing middle. How do we densify the suburbs where we've got a bunch of single-story buildings? How do we knock down 2 and put 14 homes there without it being abrupt and incredibly different to the context? How do we increase density in difficult areas? They're the things that we've been playing with a lot. But what I'm going to talk about tonight is in defence of wedding cakes, because wedding cakes are yummy and they're often associated with a really good party. So I quite like wedding cakes, but I don't like wedding cakes when they're a building. So anybody that doesn't know that term, this is what people are talking about when they talk about the result of bad planning outcomes, where over the process, little chunks are taken out of the building until you end up with this weird, ugly, sorry if you worked on one of these buildings, by the way. I blame Jonathan. And, this odd outcome. And we all know the solution. 6-story street walls, 6-story buildings straight up. And to a lot of people, that's going to sound really controversial, okay? That sounds like, a really abrupt way of changing our city. But guess what? For many, many years, other cities have had 6-story street walls. Beautiful cities that we all pay many thousands of dollars to go visit all over the world. We have some of it here as well, to Graves Lane and the rest. But in general, we apologise through this process and take chunks out of this form to create these ugly wedding cakes. And through this process, building in an extruded low-rise fashion, we're going to make it cheaper, better, faster. There's going to be less defects, more sustainable, and it's going to be more beautiful. Sounds like a big call, but if we compare that to what the current planning regime does, it does that. We would never propose a 6-story extruded building right on a street wall. This is where we start because we know we're going to be pushed to do that anyway. There's sort of mandates around 3-story street walls. We're going to do the wedding cake from the start. So we just start there. And it's a terrible starting point. Passive surveillance, for example. So a 6-story street wall allows you to look into public space. It allows you to look into the street, to passively surveil what's going on, to be able to have a conversation. At 6 stories, you can actually have it's a bit of a yell, but you can have a conversation with somebody in the street. But the moment we do this, we pull everybody that lives in those upper levels away from that community space, from the ground level, from passive surveillance, and we end up looking at our neighbour's deck. So then we have problems with overlooking private open space. And here's the real kicker. So the form factor. As soon as we do this, it's so easy to do because we've got a legal system of acquiring a planning permit rather than a design system. It's really easy for to say, well, just push that in a few metres. And the moment you do that is where we start to get transfer slabs. So really inefficiently, the loads change coming through these buildings. So we've got to pump in more concrete. Every tonne of concrete has a tonne of carbon attached to it. So we end up spending much more money on and we screw up our surface area to volume ratio. So we're ending up with a lot more surface area, and therefore a lot more surface area to volume means that we've got a lot more skin to lose heat through in winter. And where we have these decked areas, these horizontal surfaces, it's really hard to get a great thermal envelope that keeps winter heat in and stops, and we just get so much thermal load from the summer sun. And that means as well that what we end up doing is we end up putting people's outdoor decks on top of a living space. That's typically what happens. We're building in defects from the start. It is so hard to waterproof that. It is so difficult to sound isolate and to insulate that. So all of these add so much significant cost to the building. And then the other thing is just that yield. Like, we know that if you build more of something, typically the price of that thing goes down. So the moment we rob yield off a building, we are driving up the cost of all the other houses in there. They could be, 6 other apartments in there, which will drive down the overall cost of each apartment. But you know what? We're confident we're going to get a permit on that. We have to fight an unholy war. We'll never win if we try to do a 6-story extrusion. So we go in with this. We have incredible conversations with younger, early career and mid-career planners in at councils, really smart people that really know their stuff. And we have these great conversations, like enthusiastic conversations. And then you sort of see them drift off at one point. You're like, whoa, 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 this was going really well. What's wrong? And they just say, oh, I have to take this to my manager. And the story, I'm being recorded, but I want to swear. The story changes randomly. Let's take a level off, even though down the road there's a permitted 7-story building, just 5 doors down. But hang on, we need lift overruns, we need machinery, boilers, we need to run this building, we need all this servicing. We need to put it on the roof now where it's really exposed. That's fine. Chuck it up there where everybody can see it. And then there's just this other debate going on too about street walls. We thought that this was already agreed, 3-story street wall. So suddenly there's this push to bring this down, this street wall even lower. And that is what we call a wedding cake design. And we are on track with this building to nail this. And nobody likes the idea of a wedding cake. Even the people pushing us, taking the little chunks out of the building will tell you, we don't want wedding cakes in our suburb. But they don't realise the contradiction in what they're actually pushing us to do. I want us to stop calling it a wedding cake because wedding cakes are nice, okay? I want to rebrand it the way the King hits were rebranded, okay? They went from being King hits to coward punches. So I think that we need to start calling this a poop cake, okay? Because we are doing steaming hot turds all over Melbourne right now. We have for a couple of decades at least. And in the process, we're increasing costs, we're reducing affordability, we're disconnecting the people that live upstairs from the street, we're delaying housing by months, but it's just so long, sometimes years. We're making terrible outcomes for the building and the city. We're increasing the risk of defects so much. And it's such an unsustainable way to build and an unsustainable envelope. And what I say to all levels of government is, please stop encouraging this. Stop encouraging poop. And I think that most people will say we're not encouraging it. Then how do we end up here all the time? Okay, there's something wrong with the system where we end up here all the time. And what are we afraid of? Like, we're doing all of this to avoid that, to avoid a 6-story street wall that we all pay thousands of dollars to go and fly to Europe or to South America or to Chicago or New York to go visit. It's not that scary, guys. Go walk down to Graves Lane. I don't know what we're scared of. But we're paying a lot for it, financially, sustainably, and in terms of just beauty in our cities. So Sophie in our office, who is a reformed developer, and she now runs AMA, she did some calculations for us. This is going to shock you. So the cost of VCAT, hundreds of thousands of dollars of barristers and experts. Council also has to pay for their experts because they don't send their own staff. They hire lawyers as well. So there's those costs as well. The form factor, so just a more expensive built form, and the holding costs on that site because the developer here has already bought the site and they've borrowed money to do that. That has led to over $300,000 per apartment in extra costs from what was originally in the feasibility. That sounds crazy, doesn't it? It sounds wrong. But the reality is what's going to happen most likely is the price of the apartments will go up by 100,000, maybe 150, and the rest of that expense comes out of the quality of the building. And this is where we end up on the same old treadmill. The quality is going to come down, the sustainability outcomes will be less to claw back that money that is a direct cost from the outlandishly chaotic planning process. I know, Mr. Poop, I know. And this is the world that we live in at Austin Maynard Architects. We're trying to build as many houses now in this framework. So I come to you with this, what do we do right now? And what we ask for, because we're operating in that system, if that's the future, okay, we're not there. It's going to take time and legislative change to get there. The future straight out of the 19th century that everybody else is doing. But if that's the future of Melbourne, we're currently working with this. So what we ask from all decision makers is for some certainty and some clarity. So that incredible first discussion we have with early and mid-career planners in a council that give us great direction, and then the chaos starts when they pass up to their managers, can we stop doing that? because the feedback we get in those first 1 or 2 meetings are incredible, and we end up there anyway. We could just pull out 6 months and crazy amounts of money if we backed our young and mid-career planners. Why is Bayside doing it better than the inner city suburbs? Like, Bayside just came down hard on the developer and on us, saying, this is your goddamn envelope, build to that. Great. We know what we've got. There's no speculation in this. There's no chance to add an extra level. And so that certainty means that we could get that housing out and really affordably in a place like Brighton. So we're being told that, but we're ending up here. And along the process, and we've all gone through it, every architect here, the thing that you designed suddenly gets beaten, like just taking hits everywhere. So it turns into this odd thing. Finally, if we look at Parklife, so, you know, it's an exemplar winning all these awards. People have asked me, why does it look like that? It looks like that, and every architect here will recognise this. How much are you designing for the best built outcome, and how much are you designing to create something that can survive the chaotic planning process? Okay, for us, we're spending a lot of design thinking, working out how a design can survive the chaotic process. So stuff like that amphitheatre, they were 2 houses. And just this random day, remove those, we want that corner lower. Oh, great, okay, we'll turn into something else. But those 2 houses, the removal of those made every other house more expensive. It's chaos. We can do better than this. If this is the exemplar at the moment and the winner of all the awards last year, guess what? We can all do so much better than this if we just had very clear planning legislation. Ah, thank you. I didn't swear that much. That's good.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for giving us a story of the trenches. It really is like that. You're not the only person who all of us here at YIMBY Melbourne have heard from around this. Ever since we announced the Unbanning Beauty event, we've had so many architects and whatnot reach out to us and go, can we tell our story? So I don't know, maybe there'll need to be a sequel, just like there'll be a Parklife 2. I'm going to keep us moving. A town planner with more than 30 years of experience, Colleen Peterson regularly appears as an expert witness for VCAT and panel hearings and is an active participant in the professional development of the industry, representative organisations and tertiary education in Victoria. A highly regarded expert across all facets of planning and an incredible asset to the industry. Colleen regularly appears in the media and speaks on local planning issues nationally and globally. In addition to her planning expertise and passion for the built environment, Colleen continues to advocate for industry reforms to improve the practice of planning and promote an equitable approach to housing for all Victorians. Please welcome Colleen Peterson.
Well, how do I follow Andrew? That was incredible. I am that late year expert witness that has grown prosperous off the back of a broken planning system, and that is a sad reality. And I take it as my life's mission to actually make myself redundant and to move to a planning system where people like me aren't required at the tribunal every day. And I do see some faces in the room, other planners, where I do think we get too bogged down in the minutiae and that we need to really free up the planning system to focus on the really big ticket issues that are facing our society. So I'm not going to start today talking about beauty, but I'm really going to start talking about reality. Now, we'll get going. We all know that we're in a housing crisis, not just here in Victoria, but all across Australia. And I'm not here tonight to bash planning per se. There are many levers at play that are affecting the supply of housing. We've got obviously taxation structures, construction costs, labour shortages, and of course interest rates. But the reality is that the challenge of trying to build housing for 10 million Victorians is very real, and it's a pain that we've been feeling for some years. Now, despite the government's housing pledge to build 800,000 new dwellings over the next decade, we've been falling already 23,000 dwellings a year short for the past decade. And that's a figure that's really just about trying to keep up to where we were about a decade ago. It's not trying to get ahead and bring on enough supply that will actually make a difference to housing price. We know through the New South Wales Productivity Commission that if we increase the supply of housing by 10%, we decrease the cost of housing by 25%. So that is a fact, and we know that if we can increase supply, we can make a substantial increase in affordability. We know the decrease in housing supply is real. I know it's something that a number of us who work in the industry we've been feeling for the past year. We've seen the supply of planning approvals for medium density and high density housing decrease. Well, the facts from the ABS prove it. In the last 12 months, we've seen a 25% reduction in housing approvals that are medium density or high density. And they're in fact at the lowest point since 2011 and since 2009. But what do we do to increase that supply? And obviously being a planner, I can only really focus on the planning levers. But I do think that when we think about what's holding back the supply of housing, we're also holding back innovation in housing as well. And that includes innovation in technology. Technology is going to be a key to keeping costs down, but it's also innovation in the architecture itself. And I think Andrew's spoken beautifully to that earlier tonight. So the number one message that I get from not only developers, but also people from the broader community, objectors, and also from council planners as well, is certainty. That if we can get more certainty around planning, we can get the supply of at least planning permits moving forward. There's no doubt, I think, that the biggest barrier to the provision of medium density housing is the delays that occur through the planning process. And again, we've heard through Andrew tonight, delays of 1 to 2 years are clearly common. Obviously, the way in which planning pecks away at the edges of development to make it less affordable. And there's a common joke, certainly in our office, and I don't know for others who are planning practitioners here, but we often say that it's easier to get a permit for a 50-storey building in the CBD than it is to extend a single-storey cottage in Fitzroy. There's something just clearly wrong with the planning system when we're at that sort of point. Now, the Department of Transport has been working hard to try and provide some certainty around medium density housing, and I'm going to stick to that tonight and really be focusing on the missing middle, whereas Andrew's obviously talking more about activity centre planning. And we've seen the codification of things that are really quite measurable, so overshadowing, overlooking, north-facing, daylight, those sorts of things. And the idea is that by codifying these aspects of res code, you effectively take these factors off the table in terms of whether or something does or doesn't comply. If you meet the standard, you meet the test, you don't need further planning approval for that aspect. But how do we go to the next level and take out the non-standardised or non-codified aspects of res code? And the big one there is obviously about neighbourhood character. Now, because of this codification that the department is looking at, there's been a series of workshops that they've undertaken over the last 6 months, and it's pretty obvious that there is a genuine appetite to codify res code, but there's understandably some pretty significant concern about this nebulous issue of neighbourhood character. I think as planners, as a general rule, we do tend to fear it. We fear it because large sections of the community use it as a barrier to create housing, particularly in the missing middle. And those delays and the uncertainty really impact all stakeholders. But I believe really strongly that we have to learn to tackle neighbourhood character, and we really need to focus on how do we increase the supply of housing in those well-resourced inner and middle suburbs. And there's no doubt that the fear around neighbourhood character stifles innovation as well as stifling the actual number of houses themselves. So let's take a look at my favourite municipality to bag, Boring Dara, as I call it. And I'm sorry for anyone that lives in Camberwell or Surrey Hills, but I do use Burundara fairly commonly as an example of an incredibly resourced, well-resourced inner to middle municipality. You can see here we've got 2 train lines. I can't remember how many train stops there are there, but there's about 12. You've got 5 tram lines. I haven't even bothered to track all the bus routes that occur through the city of Burundara. But you can see in this next slide that apart from the areas in the darker green, about 80% of that municipality is within an 800-metre walk of fixed rail. Now, if I included bus routes, it would actually be the entire municipality is within a 10 to 15-minute walk of public transport. From a planning policy perspective, this is exactly the sort of area that we should be seeing increases in density and encouraging people to live so that they can take advantage of access to jobs, access to shopping, access to education, all of these things that we need for a healthy, active, engaged city. But instead, we have a municipality where 90% of that residential land is in the NRZ, that's the neighbourhood residential zone. That's the most restrictive of all the residential zones in Victoria, and it effectively acts as a real prohibitor to the development of medium density housing in that particular municipality. And as a consequence, what do we see? But land values in Boroondara have been going up at 3 times the metropolitan average. And that's because the supply of new housing in Boroondara is much lower than we see in other municipalities where housing growth is welcomed. What I'd also like to point out, for those of you that might be familiar with Future Homes, which is a state government initiative that's really seeking to try and instigate a Robin Boyd's inspired development package where you can buy pre-designed plans, adapt them to your site, and you can effectively be facilitated through the planning process with a expedited outcome, certainty. But of course, the Future Homes program doesn't apply in the neighbourhood residential zone. So in that royal blue colour, they are the only areas in the entire municipality where you can actually apply for that program. And I just think that's an absolute shame. So this obsession with neighbourhood character is constraining architecture and, in my opinion, actually results in mediocre outcomes. But let's talk about, well, what actually is neighbourhood character, because I think everybody has a different idea as to what that is. And I really want to use an example in my neck of the woods, which is Richmond, and about what constitutes neighbourhood character. This is Elm Grove, and I've particularly used this example because there's a street that sits directly to the south of this street. They were subdivided at the same time in the 1880s. They have the same street width, they have the same footpath dimensions, they have similar block sizes, housing of similar eras, but the contribution and the character of the neighbourhood is vastly different. And so I'll just quickly flip. This is Charlotte Street, the exact same street, but what's missing? It's the street trees, of course. So when we think about what sort of built form issues influence neighbourhood character, because remember, as planners, there's not a lot we can do about the non-built form issues around how we see a community, but we often see the feedback is around street trees. It's about the public realm, the width of the footpaths, whether or not, for example, there's grass in the nature strip. It's about the openness of front gardens, it might be the height of fences, it's about landscaping, and it's about that visual connection between the private and the public realm. So if you look at this, Elm Grove has this in spades. The poor Charlotte Street, which is just one street to the south, Church Street's actually at the end there, we see quite a vastly different pocket. If you look at the sort of housing in Elm Grove, you can see a vast diversity of housing, 1960s walk-up flats, you've got some lovely Gothic revival, we've got some classic Victorian, you've got some mock. It's a whole pocket, a whole range. And then what we see in Charlotte Street, obviously lower quality housing, and this is an example of the fact that those street trees in Elm Grove, this is actually the plane trees, they were actually their second run of planting. So Elm Grove was called Elm Grove in 1880 because they built an avenue of elm trees. About 80 years ago, those trees were due for rejuvenation. They planted plane trees again. Charlotte Street, there was never a street planting program. So what we see now as a consequence, even from the 1880s, the investment in the public realm has had such a massive impact on the private realm. So still an array of housing, still majority from the Victorian era, but more typical worker style housing rather than perhaps larger, more luxurious housing that you see up the street in Elm Grove. But the big difference here we see is really in the public realm itself. If we saw grass in the nature strip, if we saw street trees, I think we would be seeing a very different attitude towards neighbourhood character. And I think the fact that we saw the absence of street trees 100 years ago shows just how intrinsic this is from the very outset. So I believe that we can codify neighbourhood character if we think about how we measure the key elements that actually comprise this relationship between the public realm and the private realm. And to be fair, ResCode is largely doing this already. I think we've just got our knickers in a knot by overcomplicating it and thinking about aspects of neighbourhood character that are just really very difficult to define. We obviously can set measurable standards for front fences. ResCode does that already. We can have minimum setbacks for buildings. At the moment, ResCode just has a blank setback, but we could look at something that's more nuanced around ground, first floor, second floor setbacks. We can require side setbacks that are consistent with prevailing character with the street, and where there's not a prevailing character, allow for that flexibility. We can require landscaping in front gardens. We can encourage and in fact require developers to pay for street planting when there is none. I think there'd be very few developers that would have a problem with forking out $500 to plant a semi-mature street tree when they have the certainty of the building envelope that they can get through the planning process. Because I really firmly believe that if we protect the space, then what happens within that building envelope is pretty immaterial. Fundamentally, I think that the way that we have this emphasis on neighbourhood character, whether it be through neighbourhood character policies or through planning controls in Res Code, it really does very little to encourage beautiful design, and instead it actually often works against it. And we end up with a system that's really trying to ban beauty and restrict supply through uncertainty. Now, we all know of beautiful buildings that are located in areas, and what we have through Andrew's experience, and I'm sure Kerstin's about to explain as well, is that how planning adds uncertainty, delays and costs into that process. And we have many examples of buildings that break the mould of neighbourhood character, but still make significant contributions to the street and are highly valued. Now, a developer will be influenced by a whole range of factors when they're coming to develop a site. But I would say that neighbourhood character policies are pretty low down the list of that hierarchy of decision making when they're thinking about quality and innovation in architecture. There are other factors such as land values, construction costs, the target market, so whether you're designing for the young, for the old, for the hipsters or whoever, but they are going to drive the architectural outcome. And when I say architectural outcome, I'm talking about the skin of the building. I think that we're kidding ourselves that these sorts of policies in Res Code that often require very slavish reproduction of pitched roofs and eaves and brick facades, really what it does is dumb the architecture down, but doesn't result in better outcomes. Now, these images that I'm sharing are all examples of what I consider to be great medium density housing products, but they are all buildings that neighbourhood character policies seek to prohibit. And as a consequence, the cost associated with getting these buildings approved is really challenging. So I'd like to think that there was some consensus in the room tonight that if we put personal aesthetics aside and preferences, that these buildings demonstrate that when the fundamentals of the built form envelope are right and the public realm is respected and enhanced, what you put within inside that building envelope is pretty immaterial. And to do that, I think we have to have a fundamental acceptance that what I like may not be what you like, but we have a right to disagree, and we don't have a right to impose our own aesthetic beliefs on other people. This one's probably a little less controversial. There were more images than I thought. So I appreciate that the idea of handing neighbourhood character over to a set of measurable controls might be a little scary. There's a loss of control for planners in local government. There's probably a loss of control for the broader community who often use neighbourhood character to try and stymie development. But I really do believe that these sorts of policies are creating barriers to innovation. They increase the cost of housing and, of course, they decrease the supply of housing. I believe we need to prioritise these policies, and at the moment the balance regarding neighbourhood character is way too far over into conserving our neighbourhoods, and instead we need to focus on innovation. I sort of can't help but go back to the Maslow hierarchy of needs. For anyone that studied geography or politics at university, this is something that you learn in day one. But really what we're saying is that the human right to housing, which really sits down under psychological and safety needs, these are very immediate needs that everyone in our society has the right to home security and reasonable housing accommodation. And I feel that we're at a point at the moment where we are prioritising those at the very top of the pyramid, that people are interested in aesthetics, they're interested in fairly superficial areas about how a building looks, and are using that to curb the supply of housing. And really, I think we'll find in a generation a whole group of people that don't have access to that basic human right. So I do think we need to recenter that balance. We need to set a clear and unambiguous framework for housing. And I think we need to let our architects and our designers really bring beautiful housing to everyone. And by doing that and by providing more housing, we will in turn have more affordable housing. So thank you.
Would that look better with setbacks? All right, let's keep moving. Kerstin Thompson, in fact, is the design director and leader on all projects undertaken by KTA. Supported by a dedicated and skilled team, her design excellence, project success, and strategic thinking has been recognized through a raft of architectural awards at state, national, and international levels. In recognition of her work and contribution to the profession and tertiary education, Kerstin was elevated to Life Fellow by the Australian Institute of Architects in 2017. In 2022, she was appointed Member of the Order of Australia, and in 2023, awarded the Gold Medal, the Australian Institute of Architects' highest honour. Committed to design-based research and education, Kerstin is an adjunct professor at RMIT and Monash universities. As a writer and lecturer, she maintains close links with schools of architecture and professional institutes within both Australia and overseas. As well as playing an active role in the architecture profession, she also promotes quality design in the wider community through being a panel member on the Office of the Victorian Government Architects Design Review Panel. A round of applause for our final speaker tonight, Kerstin Thompson.
Hi, everyone. Okay, more on setbacks, I think. Hot topic. It did make me think I didn't speculate much on what beauty was, but maybe through, some may say this is not beautiful. Anyway, something we can talk through. I'm going to talk about a housing project, but first I want to start by saying why housing matters. Three things. Housing is about the formation of home. It's about the formation of the city, our streets and so on, and it's about social equity. So it matters enormously. And I think this right to a home is something that has been not adequately recognised, and that's exactly why we're all here grappling with this question of how to enable more housing and the place of security and tenure and being able to make a place your own. Housing and the city, it's how we form our streets, our interfaces with our public realm, our laneways, and so on. This is our Belfry Lane buildings. And then housing and equity, and it's really interesting. Everyone's talking about Alan Kohler's quarterly essay, but that quote's astonishing from 1945, this right of every citizen in our country to housing, and yet look at our situation now. So the next thing is really targeting the missing middle, and that's what I'll be showing in a minute. The 6 stories, we're all talking about that today, maybe even sneaking up to 8, who knows? Number of stories, I think, is a question, but certainly it's this middle zone that we're hoping to target. And a nice quote from Angelo, again, supporting what Colleen said before about these well-serviced existing suburbs where we really should be targeting this new missing middle housing. So the case study I'm going to talk through now is the Kerr Street housing on Wadawurrung land, and it's 51 dwellings, 8 townhouses, 43 apartments. And interestingly, it's a floor area ratio of 5.4 to 1. That's for the stat nerds in the audience. Our context, it's between Gertrude, off Smith Street, Kerr Street and George Street intersection there. Interesting to look at the fabric and the patterns of that area. And that's something we considered very closely. It's a heritage building, which is part of the McRobinson's buildings. There's a whole network of those in that area. This is what we started with, as you can see on the right-hand side, a 2-storey heritage base. So this is our longest running project in the office. It started in 2011. And I will say we did set a really important precedent with this project. It did become an exemplar, and I think that's why innovation is so important, because without change, we cannot innovate. So it's this tension between consistency and certainty, but also needing to recognise when change has to happen. So we did a lot of research about the patterns and the forms, the materials, the street patterns and grain and so on as background. And we had 3 key struggles. Jonathan asked me for struggles. So here we go. The first one was about resisting wedding cakes. The second one was about relating to heritage. How might we do that? And the third one was about innovating dwellings. So launching straight into those. I pulled these out. These are from, again, 2011. We did business as usual as one scenario for this site, which is your classic heritage with as a podium, and then the setbacks for a double-loaded corridor blob on top. And then we also proposed a perimeter block with a central courtyard because of all sorts of things I'll take you through in a minute, which was a challenge to the standard. And the second one, and this is where it leads to this, is that relating to heritage and this idea of hiding, how could we possibly hide a new extension on a 2-story envelope in that context? So it's an absurd intention, and this is one of the key things I think has to change in our future planning. This idea that new buildings should not be seen. It is bizarre. So the third thing is about innovating dwellings, bads not as good. Now, I know this gets a lot of people riled, my questions of bads. I understand it's a minimum. The problem with these sorts of things is they do become the default. And what you see even in the document, it tends to suggest a very particular typology. Again, double-loaded corridors, and these types of apartment layouts with a single aspect. So I think we have to be very careful with these and how they're used. Even though they're not mandatory necessarily, they tend to get applied that way. So back to this project. Urban morphology and pattern, we looked at this as an intersection of a whole lot of existing material qualities, red brick walls, and thought there's a cue in that for the future building. And this goes to some way of thinking through Colleen's question, what is neighbourhood character? So here's our 2-story base and the larger McRobinson's building next door, which had already been adapted. That was our start. Here's the first blob, and this is really us storyboarding to planners to try and tell them the story of why everything we did had an intention behind it, because I do think that our communication to get these things over the line is a very important part of our process. So this was like a storyboard. So here's the big blob. How do we start to manage this? What height's appropriate? Settled on it being consistent with the one next door. You'll notice there were some windows in that side building. All we had to do to comply was a fairly miserable light well. We thought the corner definition was important as well. We started to think, let's do a perimeter block instead. That's kind to the neighbours with their windows, and it's better for the amenity of the project with slim building envelopes, cross flow, and northern light into a south-facing wing. Then we thought about introducing a garden into that. And then breaking up those blocks into 3 wings, starting to introduce stairwells and so on. The southern wing, feedback during planning to lower that. And so we started to use that as a kind of anchor to the site. Holding that corner, variety of articulation, always that word articulation, more on that soon. And so here we have an elevation of that, where you can see that, that corner. So you can see this relationship between setback from heritage, not doing that, but also the link between setbacks and typologies that are possible. So in a nutshell, an existing 2-story car park that was in that heritage base is covered or encased with the townhouses to the lower level and apartments above in those wings around the courtyard. So very quickly, 2-story townhouses skinning the courtyard, and then the upper levels where the apartments are. This is all external access to everything. You can also see every apartment has dual aspect. So very high levels of amenity with both street or courtyard views. So just taking you through those quickly. The importance of circulation spaces, more on those in a minute. And then the variety of types. What this plan doesn't show is the townhouse types, but these are just some of the apartments. So the variety, different apartment types is different household types. So a walk around in context, here it is. And it was really interesting when we went to council with this is as far back as 2012, I think, and I presented this to City of Yarra Council, and to their credit, at the time we argued why we didn't need to set back or shouldn't set back the upper level from the heritage facade. And they said, are you challenging the usual default? And I was like, there is good reason not to do that, especially if you look at the pattern of development in Fitzroy with zero setbacks. So in fact, it's counter to the neighbourhood character, it's counter to the specific locale and character. And that's when we have to be very careful with these regulations, which in fact flatten, if you like, the varieties of one place over another. So just walking through this, holding that corner, and then this relationship of new and old. I think for a long time too, we all were taught juxtaposition. There must be this really dramatic kind of ham-fisted difference between new and old. In fact, there's ways of more subtlety. You might sort of, the way we sort of detectives think, the bricks, the mortar, all of these little signs of different moments. They're similar but different. And so really challenging how we relate to our heritage with our new built fabric. In this instance, the setback. So then I think, again, this relationship of challenging that setback meant the amenity levels internally were just so much better. So this is this garden in between, and you can see the neighbours, so just going back, the neighbours there look out to this rather than a light well. Walkways as social and open air spaces throughout, encourage people to use stairs, views to the neighbourhood from those stairs, and of course views into the courtyard from all of the apartments. There's the dual aspect, being able to look right the way through. It's really, really different rather than the usual tube with one window. This is a really important little detail in this place, this question of walkways and how you have people walking past and manage privacy, but also the opportunity for sunlight. These are north facing, but they're also on the walkway. So we devise screens, so if you want to moderate how you relate or don't relate to your neighbours, you just pull your screen across. And I think more of those sorts of opportunities, stop prohibiting those opportunities for people to socialise and think about ways design can manage those interfaces. And then opening up to the south in this one, more of the interiors, very high quality of amenity internally. And really, when I say good amenity, I'm not talking about finishes so much. I'm talking about things like adaptable or flexible spaces you can use as whether a bedroom or another living space. But I'm also talking about light, air, and relationship to outside and relationship to neighbours. So these are the sort of bones that we talk about as critical to good housing. Here you see use of that. Then these sorts of other areas that are shared, the rooftop on the lower rooftop. Some stats there, so 86% of dwellings here have dual aspect, and that's something I really feel very strongly about with housing. 100% east-west or north orientation for direct sunlight, and also 100% with street or neighbourhood and courtyard views for shared facilities and the energy rating. So just to sort of finish up with this one, strong urban form, a typology for mutual benefit. This question of typology is a really important one, and we need more opportunity to do different typologies. And then high amenity dwellings. So interestingly, what I would add to Colleen's comments about the outside, this is very much a building where the internal amenity is absolutely linked to its external form. So I want to finish with a last word about this question of the anomaly, because I think a lot of what we're doing with planning is on the one hand wanting certainty, and on the other hand needing the flexibility to enable doing things differently sometimes. And so just as a last thing, don't let generic rules flatten local variation, and don't let shoulds become musts and minimums. But do let FAR, rather than height, perhaps guide yield targets, and do let the delight of the anomaly. And by that, I mean challenging perhaps this idea of consistency. And this is in the background. Some of you may recognise it's Oxford Street, which I think is a marvellous example of great variety of heights that makes for a really incredible street experience. Thank you.
Another round of applause as everyone comes up onto the stage. Well, this has been spectacular. Thank you all very much for presenting. We've sort of walked through, of course, from the problems to sort of laying out some possible solutions and laying out some ways of dealing with it. How much in terms of, I guess, streetscape, how much of that is able to be sort of garnered on a development by development basis in terms of reclaiming streets and remaking streets? How much of that incidence needs to fall, I guess, on broader street planning, or is it an incremental sort of shift across development by development by development as we remake our streets?
I think it depends on the context. So how you might develop a activity centre, I think does require a centre-wide approach and a real vision about how that centre should be looking in 10 or 20 years' time. And it's very clear we need to do that if we're going to deliver 800,000 dwellings in 10 years. We really do need to see activity centres doing a lot of heavy lifting in regarding height and density, in part because of the sustainability of obviously building in those areas. I think that in residential neighbourhoods, there's perhaps some more flexibility to see more incremental change. But I think we focus too much on using neighbourhood character as a way to really stymie development in a way that's about protecting what's there rather than looking forward to what sort of future we might want.
Yeah, great. You laid down sort of some of the things that make a great street and what kind of makes neighborhood character. I guess Andrew and Kerstin, you talked sort of about individual projects. What do you think makes great streets? Starting with Andrew.
What Colleen said. She's spot on though. Like you think about Jan Gell and you know, some of the experts that sort of advise from Europe. It's the spaces between buildings that's of value to us as a community. We get so obsessed with the object in space. And the problem that we've gotten is exactly because there's not a design development overlay in that very important precinct that we're working in. But there's no design development overlay. There's no vision for what the 20-year vision is for that important precinct. So therefore, that's not discussed. Instead, the object's discussed. And everybody just holds this object without context and just says, push that bit back and pokes and prods it, trying to somehow, you know, then to placate themselves or something. But all they're doing is creating the very thing that they hate. And it is because there isn't that sort of planning overview, that vision for place.
Kerstin, do you have anything to add there?
All I was going to add is that, you know, every building, and I talk with, you know, I'm sure many have heard me say this before, but every building matters because in composite, all of our housing is what makes up our cities. So there is no excuse for one building not to not only look out for itself and its occupants, but also look out for its street. It's a contribution. It is formative of street. And so, and in turn, formative of our cities. And that's why they do all matter. So there's, and never to say something is too small or insignificant, not to take that responsibility very seriously.
That also makes me think of where planning's just ended up as a legal fight now so often. So therefore that makes neighbours, that pits neighbours against each other. So a design response, if you went to a design panel rather than a legal experts, design panel would take into account the neighbours and what is the good, what is the win-win scenario. But the moment barristers and lawyers get involved, it's like it's us against them.
I do have one positive story about exactly that in relation to that project. Interestingly, that project never went through VCAT, and I'll tell you what happened. It got officer support at council, and the councillors backed it actually because they recognised it could argue neighbourhood character and pattern and so on, and amenity. And then the neighbours in the adjoining building objected, and there was a lot of them. We went to a mediation, a pre-trial at VCAT, and the VCAT member said to the neighbours, you will never get a better deal than this one. As in, that courtyard, that relationship of mutual benefit, you will not find another developer doing that. So do it. And that's how we avoided VCAT. It's interesting. So I just thought I'd give you a good news story. It's like, but it was a very long time ago. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, and obviously we hear sort of maybe more horror stories from VCAT
Yeah.
at the moment. I think
Not
especially
others,
with it.
but yeah.
Yeah, but especially with it being being sort of so oversubscribed with long wait times, as
Yeah.
I'm sure you guys all well know. I want to talk a little bit about the city, and then I want to briefly do one or two audience questions and not keep everyone too long. Obviously, YIMBY Melbourne's Missing Middle Report, we talk a lot about Parisian density. You touched on it, Andrew. It's an easy touchstone for so many of the world's great cities. This sort of 6-story street height, 6 to 8 stories, what have you. How did we end up sort of culturally, legally, planning wise? How did we end up at a place where so much of inner Paris with like the arrondissements and the 6 to 8 stories, how did that just become sort of anathema to an inner city Melbourne and broadly inner city Australia? Is it a cultural thing? Is it the half acre of land? What is it? How do we get here?
Oh, I think I have to get some Baron van Houseman going here. Sorry, he was I think a 17th century French engineer that basically built a ring road around Paris. I think we need to look at, I think you can't simply take the European experience and translate it to Australia. These parts of these European cities that do have this incredible 4, 5, 6-story character, they were built hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But, you know, Australia's contemporary post-invasion history is clearly more recent than that. We are stuck with a colonial legacy of access to resources, obviously free access to land in a way that has never been really witnessed in Europe. So I do struggle sometimes to sort of take a strict translation of European cultural and architectural legacy and translating it to Australia. We should be inventing our own architectural legacy. And so while we can get inspiration from what we see in these dense European cities, I think there's clearly opportunity for much greater density in around our fixed rail, our tram routes, our activity centres, and this idea about 4, 5, 6-story street walls, absolutely embrace that. I don't think that necessarily translates into residential neighbourhoods, but you know, if we can get that sort of density in activity centres and obviously much higher in and around train stations, but if we can just get consistent 2 and 3-story density in our residential neighbourhoods, we'll be in a good position. And the sorts of changes that then we're seeing in those residential neighbourhoods are not as vast as what people fear, although for some people the thought of living in or next to a 3-story building is pretty tough.
What about that thought? I know Philip Thallis often talks about where we should be putting our density is actually not on the major roads, but on our parklands and where you have that amenity. So I always think that's a really interesting challenge. I will say, so the thing I always find surprising is that our roads generally are so wide compared to many other places that they are virtual, they could be virtual parks. And so it makes me even more surprised why there is this resistance to, say, 6 stories and so on, especially when you compare it to a European model where they're often much smaller sort of road widths and things. So it's a very, you know, we're perfectly set up for that, I would say. Yeah.
Great. Anything to add there, Andrew?
Not really, but anecdotally, the like Slate House, the one that I showed,
Yeah.
in Brighton, that was really interesting because most people don't know that's 14 homes.
Mm.
You know, the amount of people I talked to, we had a meeting with a council in New South Wales, and they were wanting to add some density, and we put that up there, and they were like, "Why are you showing us this?" Because like they thought it was some rich dude's house. And that's what all the neighbours think, is just somebody's come in and knocked down 2 houses and put a mansion up there. And it's like, no, that's 14 homes there. And like a lot of them are 1.2 mil, which is a lot of money. But like in that neighbourhood, it meant that like the millennials and the Zs didn't have to disappear to Brunswick and leave their family in their support network.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. That's something that we're kind of always constantly trying to communicate is that if you have a block of 16 homes and you knock down 2 of them and build a slate house, then suddenly 50% of that block is apartments and you've doubled the density on the block just by amalgamating 2 and building 14 homes at, there's 3 stories maximum height. Yeah, so it's absolutely doable to do this soft density and still get, I mean, Melbourne's population is going to double. So what? 2 out of every 16 homes, amalgamate them. If you guys could all go home, pick a couple houses on your block to amalgamate, then we'll solve the housing crisis in no time. Sophie and Nikki have got our roving mics. If we could bring the house lights up, we'll take 1 or 2 questions. I realize we're already at an hour and I don't want to keep you too long. So we've got 1 question quickly here. First question.
Hello, welcome. My question is about maybe in the context of heritage. In your honest opinion, do you think is something worth preserving just because it's old?
No.
Yeah. I think I was just saying to Colleen before, one of my favourite quotes is actually from an Italian architect, but he describes artefacts, which we might call heritage buildings, as either a propeller or a pathology. So they're either something that could promote life, a life force, or something that is a death wish. And that's how we often ask ourselves about whether to retain, adapt. And I will say we do a lot of work with heritage. We take it very seriously, especially in terms of reusing existing resources. And I really probably would say we need to be more open to some change to these artifacts, stop seeing them as perfect things that cannot be touched, to enable life force and now to happen. So it's a way to contemplate heritage.
I mean, part of the challenge we have is that so many of our heritage areas are in the most infrastructure rich parts of the city, and the heritage controls are effectively preserving whole tracts of the inner suburbs in a way that means we have literally hundreds of thousands of examples of architecture of a certain era, whether it's Federation or Victorian or interwar. Do we really need hundreds of thousands of examples to understand our history, or should we be allowing us to celebrate those inner suburbs? We can still celebrate heritage, but we don't have to preserve it. It's about how do we accentuate it and move forward.
Absolutely. And old things are of value as well. There's the embodied carbon argument. Like, we do really quickly knock down some things that are deemed ugly or not appropriate. I was so lucky that my first job was for Richard Allam in Brisbane, then Allam Lovell, now Lovell Chen. And he, one of the lead authors of the Borough Charter as well, how we assess heritage. And he was so against old buildings being treated as museum pieces, similar to what Kerstin was saying, that you need to grab these things and you need to drag it into the now. You need to make these are places for living, for life. So be creatively, wonderfully aggressive with old things to drag them into the modern age. And I come away from that with sort of this love for heritage instead of this sort of kick gloods, this idea of these setbacks where you pretend that you don't have this massive bulk hidden. And that's where we end up with facadism that everybody hates, where if you actually get in there and stack things directly on top, you actually give it a whole new life and purpose.
Yeah, I think the whole question of how we relate to heritage, it does need challenging as well. There's too many rules which are really questionable, and rules can be changed. And I was just going to say, facadism always gets people going. But I would say if you look at our Melbourne Holocaust Museum, it is a mighty fine example of facadism. For those who do or don't like it, have a look.
But going to your neighbourhood character thing, heritage has also been weaponised by the NIMBYs as well, just to stop things instead of doing what it should under the Borough Charter, which is to appreciate old things but drag it into the modern age.
Stay tuned for the YIMBY Melbourne Heritage Report coming in the middle of the year. We'll be breaking down all of this and more. Do we have a question on this side of the room so as to be geospatially equitable? Yes, second row.
Hello. My question is, how do we talk to the NIMBYs in our life? So for very brief context, my parents, homeowners, live a couple hundred meters from a train station. I was talking to them about the housing crisis, and they said, I said, I'd solve the housing crisis and all you'd have to do is give up a bit of light. And they said, I would much rather keep my light and not solve the housing crisis. The idea of putting a house next to them of 3 or 4 stories. So how do we talk to the NIMBYs in our life?
Oh, if only I could talk to my own father and my parents-in-law. Obviously, that is, I think, the $64 question, isn't it? That how do we bring people on a journey to not be afraid of change and to see that we need to keep evolving, not just as a society, but as a city. I mean, it's just absolutely integral. I think those conversations need to be gentle, they need to be respectful. And I think the best way we can do it is to try and demonstrate to people that these decisions are affecting real people and people that they love and are close to them. And I think if we can personalise the stories, that's the best way that we can have those one-on-one conversations. So whether it's to say to, for example, to my parents-in-law, where do you think your grandchildren are going to live? Have you thought about where a whole generation of children are going to reside in locations that are far away from anywhere and everything in unsustainable environments? I think there's an increasing awareness about climate change in older Australians. I know, for example, my father is incredibly passionate about climate change, but when someone across the road from him wanted to build 3 units, my God, he thought the world had fallen in. But it's about having a really long and ongoing gentle conversation with him about the reason why we need to increase densities and increase access. And I don't know if I have any more of I'm very open to other people's ideas.
I mean, all I would say is underlining that thing that we have a duty not only to current residents of a place, but also to future ones. And therein lies the tension, but it's important.
Andrew, anything to add?
Oh, just
Sorry, I have to keep prompting you.
I'm enjoying the conversation.
Yeah.
Interrupt.
You're not contributing though.
I'm trying, man. I'm trying. Amazing anecdote in North Fitzroy. There's a great NIMBY group. They're super well organised, but they've fought some great fights against some really inappropriate development there. And the thing that we decided to do was to go talk to them first. We organised an event and we invited this really motivated, they really knew the code, they really knew how to fight a fight, and explained to them with all sincerity what we've done and what we're trying to do in this important place and how it doesn't have a DDO and we need an exemplar here. And we were just so ready to get the shit kicked out of us. And we were so surprised the number of people that came up and said, thank God, finally somebody's doing something. Can you please put me on the wait list to buy these? Because my kids are disappearing up to Reservoir and I want them to stay here and go to that school and things like that. So suddenly the people that we were shit scared of were turning into purchasers. But it's about actually having a very empathetic conversation with them that allowed them to come on board instead of being adversarial and oppositional.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's really great that we've had a story from you and from Kerstin about how kind of mediation actually is, at least to some degree, possible. Obviously, you're still having problems with your project. Sorry. But yeah, these conversations are possible to have, and it is possible to have productive dialogues with almost anyone. And we need to continue to have them, but we also need to make sure that we create a system that isn't adversarial and that says yes first and then finds reasons why something is inappropriate rather than saying no, nothing is appropriate by default and then having to fight
I
back.
think that's right. There's an overwhelming attitude that how do I say no as opposed to why shouldn't I say yes? And I think that is a cultural attitude. It's certainly an attitude that I've seen shifting in decision makers in my 30 years in practice. And when I started, it was very much a glass half full approach. I've noticed particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, it's very much glass half empty. that's, I think, been quite sad for me to see just as a practitioner. I hope that we can see that shift change. I do think for the first time, and I think YIMBY and the rise of YIMBY has been really emblematic of this, where we're starting to see the power dynamic shift and that younger people are feeling more empowered and more emboldened to speak up and speak for themselves, but also future generations. And hopefully we can keep that constructive dialogue going and we'll see a shift in the decision making. I don't think we need to throw away the rule book, but we need to be more innovative and I think more realistic about what we can achieve.
100%, 100%. Yeah, I think a really good emblematic way of demonstrating kind of how the system has kind of become a thing that says no is, and for any council officers in the room, and I know there are some of you here, all council websites in Melbourne pretty much only have object buttons, no support buttons, no comment buttons. The button actually just says object.
Yeah.
The system is literally primed for negativity, for objections, and for adversarialism, rather than coming to the table to have this mediation.
There's a hack for that. So this is what we found through the first Nightingale entity was we wanted to have people sort of instead of objecting, supporting, hit that object button. It doesn't get counted otherwise. We got 400 people that said yes, and they go, great, in the legislation that doesn't count. Do object. Hit the object button, put in the most lame, it's not high enough. Put in that as an objection. And then write a letter of support with an objection in it. And you then have a step in the door to VCAT because you can't go to VCAT unless you've lodged an objection. You get left out of the whole discussion. You can't just turn up and say, I want to put my hand up. So do object.
I'll also add that you can hit the object button and just support and it still gets logged, which is nice. Yeah, we learned that kind of later in the game. But objecting and saying it's not high enough is really funny every time. It never gets old. It's in the YIMBY handbook. Look, sorry.
No, I was only going to add one more thing to this thing of litigation and the change. I will say, and I know this is not a design question, and we're here to talk about design tonight, but the fact that housing is more as people's main asset, and so protection of values is what is bound up and behind a lot of those sensitivities. So when we start to decouple housing as asset versus housing as right and start to deliver housing in different ways, then we might start to get very different openness to those sorts of conversations. Yeah.
Phenomenal. I'm going to wrap us up on a final question, quick answers from all three of our panels. What does your ideal Melbourne look like? Melbourne 2050 is what everyone's always talking about. We're going to have 8 million people here. What's one quality that you'd love to see future Melbourne have?
I'd love to see the dogs get prevented, all the poops, and the good ones get through, because so far it's harder to get something good through. And I reckon if you're 90% quality, you're going to be pushed to get 100%. If you are really shit or really poop, they'll just try and drag you up to the 50 point. And so let's start supporting the good and the exemplars and making it a bit harder for the crap.
Great.
I'm going to go at a slightly different route and say car free. So I'd really love to see. Oh, there you go. I would have, surely in 25 years from now, we will be at a point technology-wise where we have a robust public transport system and we can switch to a model of shared autonomous vehicles. There's a lot of research that shows that 10% of the vehicles currently on the road can effectively support our entire population. So when I think about what that means for the width of roads, for the absence of on-street parking, for street planting and green spaces, it would just radically transform our entire city. So that's what I'd like to see.
Here. Yeah, that's great. What I would like to see is housing all the way from Flinders Street Station all the way to Richmond Station, a cap put over all of that, acres and acres of real estate of train lines, creating a vibrant new inner suburb, like an active Melbourne, address that really links back to the river. That can be done.
Call it Taylor Swift Way.
Perfect. And this goes to your point about, that housing, we've got a very strict lens with which we look through housing in Australia. You don't realise how fixed we are, like even myself sometimes, like it is our biggest asset instead of a human right. It's impossible. You cannot go and cap all of that rail line and build housing on top, because that investment, there's no business case for that investment. It's got to, because it's housing, it's got to immediately have a payback, a profit. It's completely the wrong lens. We should be treating that human right of housing as infrastructure. Like there's no business case for putting all of these tunnels under the ground and expanding our rail line that immediately pays off. Like this is generational investment. So these things can be done. Like there is money for these things. There's ways to pay for these things. Like getting government to actually build housing the way they used to. This is not new stuff. We've done this before. Treat it as an infrastructure spend. We will solve so many goddamn problems overnight.
Yep.
Here. And you can still cut a ribbon on a house, so it's still a good political investment. All right, folks. Look, thank you all so much for coming. It's phenomenal to sell out 400 tickets to planning reform event. Thank you all so much. Thank you to Kerstin. Rolling applause, please. Thank you to Kerstin, to Colleen, to Andrew. We have small tokens of appreciation for your time. Thank you so much. It really means the world to have you here and to be advocating for a better, bigger city. Thank you so much for that. Advocacy, of course, is at the core of what we do here at YIMBY Melbourne. We love this city so much that we want to share it. And so we advocate for a bigger, better Melbourne, a denser Melbourne, and tonight, a more beautiful Melbourne. Other events later this year will include one focused on heritage reform, as we sort of teased there, another on homelessness, and a few other ideas we have on our back burner. We're a fully grassroots volunteer-run organization, which means we actually run events like tonight at a loss, in hopes that we might be able to swing hearts, minds, and the secret third thing, policy toward creating a better future for everyone. So please, a round of applause for everyone involved behind the scenes making this happen. Ethan, who's in China, who headed up a lot of our marketing and so much more. Don for being our policy rock. Katie for maintaining the biggest repository of questionable design outcomes in the city. Asanka for live tweeting tonight. And thank you to Matt for doing filming and photography. Tris, Lockie, Hugo, Sophie, Nikki, Jeremy for pitching on doors and the merch stand. And also to the literal dozen more people who make this organization so effective for giving portions of their valuable time. Please, a round of applause for everyone who makes this happen. A special final shout out to Kevin and the Archie Marathon studio team. They allow us to host our regular meetings in a beautiful creative space and a community that is just incredibly valuable. We have people in there sort of come up and give us tips, point out to us, hey, here's a case study for something that we overheard you talking about. We're not having these meetings behind closed doors. So please check those guys out and their space out. If you've enjoyed tonight and believe in our mission of reforming Victoria's planning system to enable building more homes where people want to live, then please become a member of our organization, which I have put a QR code up there. If you want to get involved, please also reach out. We have a meeting coming up this very Sunday, and we're always happy and excited to have more hands and voices on deck. We're 10 and a half months old. Our 1-year birthday is coming up. We haven't made plans yet, but when we have, we'll reach out and let you know what we're thinking. Thank you. Good night. Come mingle with us in the lobby.